Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
I'd like to talk about bringing together multiple small models of health and the need to open them up. Some experiences we have with doing this in Manchester, particularly those experiences with Microsoft Research, and to show you why I think a lot of eScience is applicable not just to science, but to healthcare in pragmatic aspects. So 3 areas I'd like to cover. What's the problem we're looking at? Well, very simply, it's late, fragmented healthcare. What's the target that I'm aiming for? I'm aiming for a target of usefully complex models of health, which are bigger models. And the vehicle that I'll describe is what we call eLab, which cuts across a number of projects, but it's basically the open union of data, methods, and people to support not just scientific insights, but more timely and specific and useful decision-making in healthcare. Ask yourselves, do you have healthcare? Okay, lots of debates at the moment in the US about healthcare. What do you have? Is it healthcare? Well, for thousands of years, we've been developing a great rescue system. We have great sickness care. We have healthcare that's perceived around a clinical model. Our resource use is focused on late stage of disease when we need rescuing. And on humane bases, of course, we must dash in and rescue the ill. But to do this, we've had to do something in knowledge management, which is to specialize to optimize our resources for that late-stage rescue. But wider health, about disease, when you may not have illness, but you have underlying disease, you have risks, the resource there, proportional to the disease and risk, has a very different optimization. There you need to generalize, not specialize, to optimize. So one is reactive, and the other is proactive. So how have we done after 5,000 years since Hippocrates of developing healthcare? How have we really done? Okay. A lot celebrated around mobile technologies, high-tech medicine, integrating that into personal health records. But how do we reach back to some of the root causes? Let's take a life course view. Okay. You're born, and your journey of your genes through your epigenetic environment has little points of no return, where they differentiate. The resulting physiology and your environment has cumulative effects. So you're losing potential healthy life years, and you eventually die. Let's consider hip fracture. Hip fracture is a catastrophic event for many elderly people. If this person fractures a hip here, the amount of healthy life year lost is enormous. The societal cost, the opportunity cost, is a large proportion of healthcare usage. For fairly small resource, we could probably delay that, and indeed structured exercise programs have a 35% relative risk reduction, which is more effective than some of our most effective medicines. Statins top out at about 31%. So important stuff for society. We have a false dichotomy. We have over here public health, prevention, well-being in its own little bubble, and over here high-tech medicine with lots of resource and lots of political debate. Now this represents the life of a person, the life course of a person, and this the life of a parliament. Quite naturally, any instability to a healthcare system is a political difficulty. But we need to build models if we're to make healthcare more effective and affordable back to how does it wire together at early stages of disease. And that's why I need big models, because we can't afford this system. eScience can help, I believe. And here we need to deal with data-flooded healthcare, which is what we have at the moment, and turn it into data-intensive healthcare. Big gaps, big fragments between self-care clinical care, primary care, secondary care, hospital A, hospital B. Huge ravines of communication that lead to medical error and medical inefficiency. What have we done to cross those gaps? Well, in the past 20 years, there's been a big knowledge management exercise to create integrated care pathways. But those integrated care pathways go down those clinical silos. Okay, I said we specialize to optimize in late-stage care. So we have highly specialist clinical care pathways on specific diseases developed by specific disciplines. We do not have models that cut across different care pathways. But the patient presenting with type 2 diabetes, chronic kidney disease, maybe arthritis, maybe coronary heart disease, is a model across those different care pathways. We do not have those models across the care pathways in routine clinical practice. So where do we want to be? We don't want to be with health records and individual integrated care pathways managed by clinical silos. We want to have an integrated model. The maximum synthesis, the maximum information utility is not a health record. It won't look like a health record. The union of all of the useful bits of information about what's happened to that person, how they vary according to the average person and how they responded to treatment is much more like an avatar. So I think future health record debates at the moment lack a discussion of models. Models beyond individual care, models of population healthcare. I'm a public health doctor, so I pull in projects that try to bring the structure from evidence, papers in one part of an evidence base with papers in another, so that policymakers can come together and say, well, what if we invest in statins down here? What bang are we going to get for our buck compared with investing in physical activity and earlier stage interventions? Very complex synthesis of evidence, but there is a lot of structure that you can add and a lot of quantitative modeling to be done to bring together existing health evidence to optimize our healthcare systems. This is particularly important at times of economic austerity. And this is some work we're doing in the Medical Research Council across a number of different disease areas. So this has produced some software for that what-if scenario planning. The software has to be available to interact with the decision maker. It's not enough to produce a report for an option appraisal meeting in a health-paying organization, or in the UK in a health authority primary care trust. The what-if scenarios, what if we turn up the dial of the statins, what if we turn up the smoking cessation, playable models that combine the evidence at the point of decision making. So that needs a platform for both opening the evidence and building bigger models that can influence those decisions. Many disciplines coming together. The model I showed you before was a synthesis of not only the natural history of disease, you can see progression of disease down here, but it's also a map of how we wire together our services. So you're building graphs across disciplines as well as across papers. But have we got the evidence? If this represents all we could know about how an individual or a population would respond to treatment, this is what's in the vast, but in context, this is the relevant relative size of the evidence base. And this is what we're missing. Because clinical trials are done in patients usually who don't have other diseases than the one under study. They're not done in women of childbearing age, people on other medications. So when a medication in particular is released, there's a natural experiment taking place of healthcare. So how are we going to extract those natural experiments and build a bigger model of care? There are many initiatives to pull together data. But do we really want to create a great big tomb of data? Well, it just gathers digital dust. The different tribes feeding in their data to the tomb without interacting with the data don't provide rich contextual metadata because they're not part of the model. So we're not getting the metadata we need for the better models. So one of our projects, a large-scale building of a system to extract research-ready data from healthcare records is assembling the data that we have, but allowing the transformed data to be played back to the people who collect the data. So we're dealing with this data flood by being very interactive with the people at the front line of healthcare, which is quite difficult and quite messy. But constantly I'm reminded that the contextual expertise is the bottleneck. Very few people actually transforming data and questioning the data and whether we need to capture more. This is typically what we're doing in creating an e-lab in the health service to bring data methods and people together. An enormous effort is going into the issues of privacy protection and making sure there isn't deductive disclosure of anything that leaves the firewall of healthcare or clinical information governance, so that a patient isn't maliciously or accidentally identified when they don't need to be. That has created anonymized repositories that consist of every transaction taking place in the cloud of care, ranging from hospitals, general practices, out into the community, such as opticians, pharmacy, and demographic data. And I believe this is where you should put a lot of the life science effort, when you've got a really clean phenotype, because it's a very messy world out there in routine care. So mounting some of these studies in here has proven very useful. What the service need, not to be that donkey hanging aloft, is a sense-making layer. So we have a lot of effort to build statistical and visualization software on top of anonymized repositories for defined populations where the people observing the patterns in the data also observe the population. So what happens when you do that? This is an audit question that was asked of me by a colleague who looks after people with type 2 diabetes and obesity. On the vertical axis is the red blood cell concentration. So people down here are anemic and feeling tired and listless. These people have type 2 diabetes. On this axis is their kidney function, estimated glomerular filtration rate imputed from their creatinine blood tests that are done regularly, their age and sex, and optionally their ethnicity if it was well coded. Just by pulling the data together, we found that this drop-off point, as kidneys are shrinking and not sending enough signal to the bone marrow to produce more red blood cells, was much earlier than in the natural history than was previously thought. So that there was much more of an alert that we should be looking out for anemia. The practical side, the audit loop was closed by changing test ordering in this hospital information system. But this is quite an important paper that makes us ask questions as to why we're this sensitive to anemia in type 2 diabetics. We couldn't have done this unless we captured some more metadata. It was a noisy signal to begin with, and then the chemical pathologist came along and said, well, I changed the lab assay halfway through your data capture period for creatinine, which means we had to use a different formula to derive this statistic here. If this data had been derived from one of those big data tombs without the metadata about the lab assay, we wouldn't have got a clear picture. This is to stress the importance of playing this back, models that people interact with at the front line. So to get a mandate to do that amount of playback, we need to be very clear about how the data was used, the provenance, the audit, the when, what, where, why, and the context. So this brings us to a concept of packaging together the processes of the data on the anonymized repositories, which we call work objects. If you consider this is what's done now all around the world, some very expensive initiatives, but they extract data from health agencies, put them into a research agency, and build a research governance around them. So they put security around here, they put ethics around here. But if you can mount, you make the software move into the place where the data is being observed, then you've triple insulated in terms of governance. This is more ethical. This is more secure. And this is why we're building our e-labs in the field of healthcare. Very practical things, like recruiting people for clinical trials. If over here you've got the anonymized side of integrated healthcare data, and these people are eScience-y sort of competencies, where they're very good at extracting the right data in the right way, and demanding the right sort of metadata. So the queries are optimized here, the data transformations are optimized. But we build software to preserve this clinical care boundary. So in this case, query to identify people eligible to participate in a clinical trial, delivered through secure email to clinician. It's only the clinician who can see the identities of the individuals. This is the anonymized side, but the query, click, run, back through to database, but using this particular query, so this individual can recruit those patients, thereby preserving consent for consent. Practical things, but it gets us to the front line. Then we have to scale up to work across multiple localities to get bigger studies. There are 10 developers currently working on building that infrastructure. It's based on two streams of functionality: a resource bus for transforming the data, and a work object bus for describing, storing, transferring, managing those packages of processed data. This is different just to a workflow view of eScience, because the research object in a clinical setting might have to have a special audit applied to it. You might have to prove in a legal context how you arrived at a particular piece of information at a particular time. So you might have to replay that analysis. So sometimes you may need to encapsulate the data in the work object, the analysis script, the annotations, all of the outputs. But this also enables the healthcare organization to increase organizational memory, because the person can pick up and deconstruct how a particular job was done. And that's important to healthcare organizations. They're very strapped for analysts. Now let me move from that healthcare world into the discovery side of health sciences on different data, conventional cohort studies, etc. No matter how high quality your studies are, usually in medicine, we have a concept space or a problem space which is much bigger than that we can measure. So our models are often like looking through a prism at measurement error, through a doily at concepts, missingness and measurement error. So this is another reason I need to bring in the abstract reasoning of the investigator into the analysis of the data. In recent years, we have additional signal paths to consider, particularly through biotechnologies, systems biology, proliferation of biomarkers, putting a greater flow of differently characterized data into this concept space. But this comes into a world where there is a very orthodox, parsimonious approach to making a causal inference from a set of associations, extremely cautious and rightly so. The sieving for associations has decades of discipline. I won't go through all of the details, but to say an association is causal and that no, grey hair doesn't cause heart attacks is a set discipline. But that's exhausted because it's very good at handling small numbers of factors, and we've sieved out the big important causes of ill health as independent risk factors. What we're really interested in now in a systems view of health are the webs of causality to give us those bigger models of what works together from the simple big stuff we already know. Let me give you an example of taking an orthodox approach to epidemiology where we've applied some less orthodox statistical analysis with our colleagues in Microsoft Research. Now, this is a population-based birth cohort, recruited. Mum, when she's pregnant, was asked if her child-to-be would take part in the study. 1,000 children have been studied over now 11 years, and they're reviewed annually. So this study is to look at asthma and allergies. The measurements are some of the most detailed in the world. So unlike the messy routine healthcare world, these are very careful measurements over a long period. The outcomes that have been looked at are through questionnaires on particularly respiratory symptoms. Very careful tests, skin prick tests, blood tests, challenges to substances you breathe in and looking at the functioning of your lungs. So, controlled measurement environment. And also air filters in the home. So really strong environmental measures, very objective. Blood has been collected from these children, and recently we've extracted DNA and are about to embark upon genetic epidemiology. As a precursor to that, here is some work with our colleagues in Microsoft Research to take a graphical model, probabilistic graphical model approach to the epidemiology. So rather than a few factors, we want to consider all of the relevant factors. And what I've asked these investigators to do is to come together and define the organizing principle of the problem they're solving. And it wasn't asthma. It's not a diagnosis of asthma, it's peripheral airway obstruction. And as soon as you got this kind of reasoning to develop, to bring out the structure that we can seed our searches of the data sets for, some wider thinking, some bigger model thinking came out. We started by looking at this side. It's what sensitizes you early in life to eventually develop asthma. So this is the model we've used. So skin prick tests and blood tests to challenges such as house dust mite, egg, pollen, other substances. What we've done is to say that there is a latent class. There's something we can't measure about sensitization. And when you're sensitized, you may desensitize. So not all of these children go on to be sensitive. So we created a Markov model across the years, chaining together the sensitization and desensitization to all of these different substances to say, is there something more? Are there more classes than the allergic child, which is what is currently diagnosed? And this is what comes out. If we just restrict the work to 2 classes, and this is done using Microsoft Infer.net, we see a very strong clustering of these children have got red is lots of sensitizations, blue is few, green is in the middle. So where there are lots of sensitizations, particularly early on, there's a much greater proportion of children who eventually at age 8 develop asthma. We'll then allow the algorithms to go in an unsupervised way and search for more classes. And what happened then? Well, this is what happened. We separated out clusters based on the allergens and on the age the children were sensitized, those who had multiple early sensitizations. So a cluster of children, a class among this previous homogeneous group that we call the atopic child, those with lots of early sensitizations, lots with late sensitizations, those predominantly sensitive to house dust mite, and those predominantly sensitive to pollen. And what if we relate those clusters to the wheezing? Well, this is a massive effect. So those with lots of early sensitizations had an odds ratio of 31 compared with the others. So there were enormous differences between the different sensitization clusters in who was going to develop asthma. The interesting point here is that an unsupervised approach, a machine learning approach to the epidemiology, validated a synthesis of all of the evidence and abstract reasoning. So this made sense to our clinical investigators and our biologists who've been studying this for many years. And it built the model with less investigator bias than is usually done. So we're using the data to be more objective. So usefully complex model building. What do I want out of these e-labs? Are there some key ingredients? Well, clearly, I want a lot of functionality. But a core component is privacy preserving. To be trusted to go in with our eScience software anywhere near a healthcare record is a big job. To get in there and have to expect that a group of information system managers would do the connections to computing resources themselves is another big ask. So we want invisible high-performance computing. And we also want ways that methods are so well described that they find people describing problems. So we can get this statistical borrowing of strength, the incorporation of a small model into a bigger model at the point that people are reasoning about the problem and thinking less about the process of the data, keeping their mind on what the human brain is good at, making the links in abstract between pattern here and a pattern there with something not measured in the middle. Now, let me just give you one example. This is the UK's Foresight group that discussed the public health crisis of obesity. And this is a kind of concept map they developed. Oh. There we go. It's not allowing me. Right. I'm going to force it. It won't win. Yes, it will. Okay. Well, if I could show you that, there is a massive diagram of all of the concepts that wire together the field of obesity into multiple subdomains. And those subdomains represent tribes of investigators. Tribes of investigators who've built small models for many years that don't wire together around the organizing principle of energy balance. So we get much smaller inference and often biased inference, investigator-biased inference, than we really need to be useful. So what I need is an open unifying principle. I need to build these sub-models into larger models. I need easy computation, and I need my domain experts to be reasoning in abstract to create more complete insights, to get more reusable evidence. And that is the same challenge as getting better management across different diseases. You're trying to synthesize the evidence to make a decision for a patient. If we can do that, the model should reach back to the earlier points of disease, and we should get better early intervention. And if that can plug into the signals we're getting from consumer health, we could get greater citizen involvement. So overall, we need to build more realistically complex and usefully complex models. There are many common pathways which, for good common sense, say we should look across these different domains and start building unified graphical models. But putting that together relates not only to the deep research, but also to health policy building. It's of a similar size intellectual challenge. And here in an eScience setting, we're addressing that challenge, bringing data, methods, and people together. But is it really that different from the setting that's looking at optimizing our healthcare system, of bringing those lots of small models to say, how do we use a limited resource? Both need open, unified, and unifying and usefully complex models. And I think in this context, Jim Gray's legacy may have much wider implications. Thank you for listening.
Are there any questions? Well, I actually have one as well. Oh, go ahead.
My wife happens to do drug assessments for life.
Mm-hmm.
And so they have to work out these quality-adjusted life years to decide whether a drug should be available on the NHS or not. And so they do the evidence-based research on all the drug trials done worldwide on a particular drug and need to synthesize that to the panel. I mean, is this approach, it seems like a more sophisticated approach than perhaps what they're doing with an Excel spreadsheet.
Yes, this...
Is perhaps a slightly better, more in-depth way of doing that evaluation? It's very controversial.
Yes.
In the US, it's called an improved death panel.
We took the spreadsheets that were used in NICE assessments as the basis for this. The spreadsheets had simple Markov chains propagating individuals from one state to another. But for those of you who are statistical, Markov models are memoryless. So that assumes that the patient transferring from one state, from after their heart attack to their heart failure, that transition is not related in a mathematical way to earlier transitions, such as how quickly did they move from high blood pressure into their first heart attack, which is nonsense. So we want to extract the structure. That's why we think graphical models are very useful. If you can maintain the reasonable structure about the natural history of the disease and the structure of your services, then you can synthesize the evidence with that structure, and you can add expert opinion about the structure and about the transition probabilities, as well as simply extracting a limited number of transition probabilities from the literature. So it's exactly that sort of challenge that we're addressing here for health policy, eScience, if you like.
Do you mind if I ask you a question?
Please do.
So there was a challenge when you're doing comorbidities, and I was curious, because things can be, as you said, you need to be very cautious about making relationships that don't maybe naturally exist, or they do exist but are could be irrelevant. And I'm wondering, I understand the statistical process whereby you generate, not this model, but the big model you weren't able to show us. And I'm just curious, how does the expert interact with that in order to improve that model? How are you enabling that piece?
In two ways. You saw an example of unsupervised learning from a set of data where the factors the experts considered were important. So trawling through that factor space, the experts would look at different clustering and then say, well, what characterizes the cluster? Is there something outside the study I've measured? So, for example, those early sensitization, late sensitization classes of the children, we may not have measured factors, but there may be a hint of what characterizes them from a few covariables describing them. You'd then want to go measure for the next year of follow-up of those children. So that's in the carefully measured space of building a bigger model and being cautious about potential confounding factors. One of my students presented something earlier this morning, which was from the health surveys. And the health survey for England is something done every year. It's been done since 1992. Measures about 1,800 variables on around 20,000 households. So you've got a very large set of variables. And the role there, the investigator would interact with a unified modeling approach there to add to a model subsets of factors. So the search would be around structure that is thought to be meaningful, building out from that. But it would be a search that's less biased than the investigator just selecting on the basis of their prior knowledge. So the search would use their prior knowledge to filter, but factors would be added on a machine-learned basis. So it's assisted reasoning, if you like.
Is that where inferred on next?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, well, let's thank both of our speakers, and thank you for attending the session.